Welcome to the Arlington Catholic Herald podcast. We've got stories you won't find anywhere else. I'm your host, Mary Staccara Lopez, and today I'm on the phone with Dave Miller. He's an expert in Irish genealogy based in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and also happens to be the cousin of our own staff writer, Leslie Miller. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So can you tell us how you became interested in genealogy and why you decided to start doing it professionally?
Well, I have been involved in working on genealogy either on my own or regarding my own family or on just doing some research for other people for quite some time. In fact, my interest actually started when I was in grade school, and we had to do it as a school project. And I remember both my dad and my mom were calling up great aunts and uncles and getting them to talk about some of the family records. So and the information, and I kept all that, and so that when I got out of school and started adulthood, and I was going through some of this, and so I decided I'd straighten it out. And it's one of those things where they always tell you once the bug bites you, it just never goes away, and that's pretty much been the case ever since then. So I've been involved in genealogy at some point, either working on my own records, and I've had a couple of family members. Leslie's dad was one who always had a bunch of family stories that he used to tell. So one of the things I decided to do was try and prove some of these stories correct. So I did, actually. Some of the stuff that he used to tell us, we kind of look at each other, but it turned out that they were fairly true. So we were in. It was, and so one of the things with genealogy that I always think is interesting is not just the names and dates, but the stories that you can get from other family members. And so that's essentially what I've done is I've been writing some of that down, and I just finished the story when I was in Ireland a couple of months ago. Actually, it was more like 4 months ago. I did a story on an ancestor who no one knew very much about. This would have been my third great grandmother. My great aunts knew about her, the third great grandfather, but nothing about this. They only referred to her as the second wife, and we knew all about the first wife, but we didn't know anything about the second wife. And so I was talking to a few people at the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, and I was kind of trying to get some ideas of how to research this a little bit. So I started looking through some records and found that she had been involved, and long story short, she had been involved in a scandal, if you want to call it that, in as far as she was accused of trying to poison her sister-in-law. Yes. No. And this happened in 1842. And my third great grandfather was the executor of his brother's estate, and so he had control of all this property around this area, and so he was supposed to give the widow, apparently, of the brother's widow, so much money per year. Well, apparently, it was a little slow on getting that money over to her each year, and so I guess she just decided that she would accuse her of trying to poison her with some solution in the wine, what glass of wine she was drinking at the time. And so there was a trial, and the trial showed that she couldn't have done that because they claimed that the solution had dissolved in the wine, and the medical superintendent said that's impossible. In fact, he said, I even give some of my patients that, on a small dosage, so it wouldn't have hurt her that badly to begin with. So she was acquitted, but then right after that, she had some health issues and died not too long after the trial. So that was kind of one of those stories that you just can't make up, that it's really, I've had a number of stories that have been, I've found that have been pretty similar to that. So they're always really interesting. I think that's the kind of stuff that people like to know, especially the next generations coming along. They want to know some stories about the family, what they did, and how they lived, and what they enjoyed doing for hobbies and things. So when I tell people about how they should start, I always use the start with yourself. Begin with you and what interests you. What did you do for a living? Where did you live? And things like that. And, tell me about your family. What do you remember? And things of that nature. And then you can start going back. But that's always a good starting point for people who don't know where to begin with genealogy.
Well, I was going to ask you what some of your favorite projects are that you've worked on, but it's hard to top that, I would imagine.
That's been the bigger one so far that I've done. One story, in fact, my uncle was always, and I wrote this story up. In fact, this is Leslie's dad was always really good for stories, and he told me this one time about how he, when he was 5 years old, my great-grandmother had passed away, and so at that time, and this was in the early 30s, they would, and it was fairly warm, I take it, and so they would always put the body out for a wake in the parlor of the house, and so they had put dry ice on underneath it and covered with a towel, and then placed the casket on top of that. And so they brought the kids in, all the grandchildren, and my dad and my aunts and my uncle, and my uncle was only 5 years old at the time. So apparently he walked up there and saw some of the smoke from the dry ice coming underneath the curtain. And so he lifted it up and turned around and looked at my grandmother and said, "Why is Grandma on ice?" And so I wrote a story about it, about how, that was, from the mind of a 5-year-old, how,
right.
Interesting that would be, and so I said, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Well, the only thing I remember is my grandmother took me by the hand and then walked me out the door." So, he said that I never did go in, I guess, the rest of the time, but it was actually such a funny story. I thought it was, really worth mentioning, and it's something that people will remember too down the road.
Yeah. So for the absolute beginner who's really interested in finding out about their own family history and about stories like, maybe not exactly the same, but stories like that, how would you suggest starting out?
Well, as I was saying a few minutes ago, I think the best way to start is with you. And, I think dates and names are very important when it comes to doing your genealogy. But I also think that getting information about various people in especially ones that affected you in your life as you were growing up, those are the things that people will want to know about from years from now. Long after we're all gone and the next generations start to look into genealogy, and I'm sure it'll be around for many, many years to come. So the first thing I would do is just start with you, and then go into what you know of mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, and you can start putting names and dates down. There's a number of software programs that are out there. Roots Magic, Family Tree DNA, Family Tree Maker, and then there's a couple of free ones. There's one that's called Ramps. I've used that a few times too. So you can download some of those, and the ones that you can get at most of the retail stores as well. And then start using it. If you're not real good with computers, that's fine. There's certainly, you can download sheets that provide timelines or family group sheets or pedigree charts, things like that, and then you just start working your way back from there. There's a number of online sites that you can use, but I think the first thing to do is check with other family members, see if there are things that you can find from other, and then verify that. Everything that you do, you should always have some kind of sourcing with it, some verification with it, so that if somebody else wants to look at the data, they know where you got it from, and they can verify it. Sometimes you get information that gets on some of these sites, and they're not exactly correct, and then you find out later that you have to go start over again. So good to verify everything that you put on your family group sheet, and make sure that you have enough information there to show people where you, and you just, as long as you're consistent on how you source it, I think, you do it pretty much the same way. I think that's really a good way of doing it.
One of the things I've noticed as I've started doing some research into my own Irish ancestors is I kind of pretty much realized within a couple weeks that I needed some kind of organizational system. So how do you suggest that people store all these photos, census records, birth certificates, everything they're finding?
A number of, I mentioned some of these online sites that you can set up a family tree on. You can also put some media on there as well. In other words, on some of the family tree programs that are out there, either not just the online, but the ones that you go to the store and purchase the CD and slip it in your laptop or your PC and then be able to put together. You can actually put some graphs on there, media, census records, things of that nature. Then pictures. The ones I have, the program that I use right now, I have 4,000 names on, and I have a number of, wherever I can put a picture, I'll try to put a picture of if I can find it and I have permission to use that picture, then I generally will put it up there and use the program. So a number of places. The other idea would be to keep obviously an online folder, maybe on, if you use Google Drive or OneDrive on Microsoft, or one of those programs where you can actually keep it in the cloud and then generate a folder for each family. And then within that folder, you may have to put subfolders in there and be able to keep the information. When I have a folder on a particular family, I'll have probably several different subfolders within that main folder where you have the individual's name on there. So that's one way of keeping things organized. But you brought up a good point, because we should really keep things. One of the things that makes genealogy research successful is the fact that you can keep your information rather organized. And even as organized as I try and keep it, sometimes I get confused on different things. So it does happen. But you're right. The more organized that you can keep it, the better that you can move along with the next bit of information you're searching for.
Right. And one of the places that people could look for things are the archives of the Archdiocese of New York. Is that right? And a few other places?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's a number of Catholic records were never, for a long time, you could go in and research them, but they were never digitized until just recently, within the last, I'd say, 10 years. There's a number of dioceses and archdioceses now that are allowing their birth and baptismal records, and marriage records, and burial records that are being digitized now. You mentioned the Archdiocese of New York. The New England Historical Genealogical Society has actually been doing a project on the Archdiocese of Boston's records right now, and many of those are now digitized on their site. You can find the Archdiocese of Chicago site on FamilySearch.org. I've seen a number of those records. And when we talk about Irish records, within the last 5 years, the National Library of Ireland has started to post much of the Catholic records that were in the middle 1800s, from about 1846, I believe. Actually, they're a little earlier than that, but then they extend all the way up to about 1890. And I'm not sure what the plans are as far as going in a little bit later than that. But right now, those are the records that you can find online by looking at registers.nli.ie, and that's with the National Library of Ireland. So a number of Catholic records. There's this myth that's been going around for a long time that Irish records were just impossible to find, and there was no way to be able to get any information at all on them. And the reason for that was because of the Four Courts fire, which occurred on the 30th of June in 1922 in Dublin. And this was just prior to the Republic being started in Ireland and the breakaway from the United Kingdom. And the fire destroyed a number of records. Most of those records, though, were Church of Ireland diocesan records. They were parish records, rather. There was also a number of wills that were destroyed and census records that were destroyed. But what we found is that some of those records were kept in local custody. In some cases, parish pastors were keeping other records and then making copies of them before sending them up to Dublin for to be archived. And so what we would find is that some of these records still existed, but they were sitting in local custody, or they were in different archives. In case of Catholic records, they were never really put in the Four Courts building to begin with, so they were always kept in some local custody, or also in some of the local Catholic libraries that were existing in the country at the time. So some of these records were still good. A lot of the land records remain in existence today because those were always stored at the Registry of Deeds building. In the case of wills, many of the wills index still exist, although some of the wills themselves don't anymore. Although I did find a book a couple of times now at the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland where it's just a book of wills, and they were transcriptions of the wills. They weren't the actual originals, but they were transcribed, so you can get at least the information out of that. So some of these records still exist, and what's going to be happening since they're coming up with the 100th anniversary of the Irish Republic in 2022, there's a site that is being established by Trinity College, and it's called beyond2022.ie, and supposedly that's going to have a number of digitized records. Some of them that existed in the Four Courts building, but as I mentioned, they were sitting in copies that were made, but the originals probably were destroyed, but these copies still remain in existence. So some of these supposedly are going to be digitized and put on this website, and we'll see how that all goes coming up. So there's a number of records that are out there. I know we kind of went off the subject here a little bit with the number of records, but the Catholic records is just one of many that are now starting to show up on websites, and which is certainly good for genealogists who want to go and family researchers that are trying to find out more about their families and some of the locations that they lived in and when some of their family members were baptized.
Well, that's really neat. So for people who are really ready to dive into this, I hear that you're going to be speaking at an Irish genealogy conference in Chicago. Is that right?
Yes. That is coming up on July 31st. I'm not speaking. I'm emceeing it.
I'm seeing it.
I don't know if they really trust me at this point as far as the speaking part, but no, I'm only kidding. They actually have, it is sponsored by the Irish Genealogical Society International, and they're headquartered in Mendota Heights, Minnesota, and they're co-sponsored by Tiara, which is out of Boston, Massachusetts. So every other year they've been holding the conferences. 2 years ago it was in Boston, and 4 years ago it was in Minneapolis, and this year it's going to be in just outside Chicago in Wheeling, Illinois. And it will be on the 31st of July and the 1st of August. And John Grenham, who is a renowned Irish genealogist and has done a lot of work in that area, and he's from Dublin. He's going to be there. Fiona Fitzsimons, who has started NCLAN, and she has been doing Irish genealogy for a number of years, as her husband, Brian Donovan. Well, Fiona will be there as well, and we have a number of other speakers that are going to be in attendance at that conference from England, and I think one from Scotland, and a number of people from around the U.S. as well, who have been researching and have either written books or articles on the subject. So they're expecting a pretty big crowd, and registration right now is open, and the registration site is called Celtic-Connections.org. So people can sign in there. There are still the hotel is still has some rooms available, and I believe the hotel is Celtic Connections Conference, 31st of July and the 1st of August, and it's at the Westin Chicago North Shore Hotel in Wheeling. And as I mentioned, the website is Celtic-Connections.org. And you can register there. They do have some rooms available there, but there's a number of other hotels in that area.
Wow. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you asking me to join you today, and hope we do it again sometime in the future.
For more informative and inspiring news, go to CatholicHerald.com/subscribe. This episode was produced by Stacy Roush. Thanks for listening.